Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Today we are joined by a very great American writer, T.C. Boyle. He's going to talk today about a new collection of short stories called Wild Child, Stories by T.C. Boyle. Thanks for stopping by.
It's my pleasure, Jim. I'm, not only out running around with the hardcover of Wild Child, but also
that's right,
the paperback release of The Women.
Which you and I chatted about some time ago.
Mm-hmm. That would have been about a year ago, I would think.
I guess so. Yeah. Well, the time does fly, doesn't it? Ooh. This is in terms of the short story. Somewhere it told me it's the 9th collection of such stories that you have published. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I am a devotee of the short story. I think most of the writers of my time either write novels or stories, but not so many write both, and it gives me a natural rhythm. Once I finish a novel, I turn my hand to stories, which is what I'm doing right now, by the way.
Working on a novel.
Nope. I finished the novel.
Now you're into stories?
July.
Oh, goodness gracious.
It's called When the Killing's Done, and it has to do with the Channel Islands off the coast of Santa Barbara. And since then I've been writing stories, and some of the listeners may have seen recent ones. There was one in Harper's in January, My Pain is Worse Than Your Pain.
Okay.
And another in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, A Death in Kitchewank, a memory story of where I grew up, upstate New York.
I read that one myself.
Oh.
That is a very haunting tale.
Yeah, it's very powerful. It's something I'd been wanting to write about for many, many years. It's about the death, a murder, actually, or I guess not a murder, a man died in a fist fight, and this was the father of a close friend of mine. I was sort of the third son of this family, and I wanted to address it, but I didn't know quite how all these years, and I think I finally was able to do it. You did
in spades. It's a wonderful, powerful story, and quite disturbing too, incidentally. As a writer, you make me wonder, is this switching back and forth, this is that internal rhythm that you have, which determines, in your case, whether it's going to be a collection of short stories or a novel.
Yes.
And it's not...
Well, of course. But, I've never started a story and felt this must be longer and turned it into a novel, nor have I started a novel and felt, well, that's enough, here's a story. I'm always working in a separate period, very determinedly, on one thing or another.
That's good.
Oh, I don't know if it's good. It's just
No, I think it is. I think it is. I mean, the fact that you maintain, a kind of wall of difference between them, I think makes both of them better.
Well, thanks. I really hadn't thought of it in that way. I always just thought of it in, this is, as you said, the rhythm in which I work, but I hope so, yeah.
This collection of short stories, in a way, begins with an epigraph from Thoreau. Mm-hmm. And the line is, "In wildness is the preservation of the world."
Yes.
And nature is a dominant theme in this collection.
Yes, there's lots of wonderful stories in here about animals and about our animal nature and how those forces collide, including the novella which anchors it, called Wild Child, which is a retelling of the story of Victor of Aveyron, the feral child who was captured in Napoleonic France and held up for display in Paris.
Mm. And then, that's a fantastic story, and we'll talk more about that later. Early in the book, there's a story called La Conchita, mm-hmm. and I wrote down in my notes that this story does not quite fit the epigraph. Well,
I don't know. Of all the collections I've done, I think this one has more of a thematic through line, because I've never written a book of stories around a given theme specifically. These are simply stories that occur to me. It could be anything. Whatever I feel like doing, whatever I want to find out is a story. So in this case, though, I do think that the rubric of Wild Child and in wildness is the preservation of the world do play out in a lot of these stories. Not all of them, of course. Mm-hmm. A lot of them have to do with displacement. That is, people or animals in places where perhaps they don't belong. A story like Ash Monday would illustrate this. As for La Conchita, This, for those who don't know, is my investigation of what happened in the little beach town of La Conchita, 15 miles south of Santa Barbara, during our last El Nino a few years back when the mountain collapsed. There was a huge mudslide. A few people lost their lives, and several lost their homes. And I wondered what that all meant.
Well, what it means in this story is that an event like that, when a person is drawn into it and participates in it they can be utterly, utterly transformed.
I think so.
That man goes from being kind of small and sniveling into a bona fide hero.
Wow, I like that interpretation. Well, our man driving the car is a courier, and he's bringing a liver for transplant to Santa Barbara. The road is closed. He's got the airport's closed. He's got to drive it there, and he's a real road warrior, and he is raging at the other drivers and so on. But when the road is blocked by the mudslide, he is static. He can't go anywhere. And at that moment, a woman comes up to his car, beating on the windshield, begging him for help, and drags him by the wrist up the hill. Her husband and child have been buried, and there are no tools. There's nothing, and they begin with their hands to try to dig them out.
Yeah, and the hard-nosed hustler gets down on his hands and his knees and digs and digs and digs. And then there's the irony in the story that the liver gets delivered by the guy who's his opponent in business.
Yeah.
Not nice.
No, but these stories to me are just so much, bring so much joy into my life, because I don't know what the story will be or what will happen in it ever. I don't know what it is until I get there. And so a story like this, I'll meditate on La Conchita. I went there and looked around. I talked to some people. I read some articles, and I began to write in the voice of this guy. And I didn't know what would happen to him or how he would change his ways, or even if he would. And so it's always quite amazing for me to see how a story will turn out.
Well, because this is a T.C. Boyle collection, it has a bit of everything, from a house full of rats to a mom of a Major League Relief pitcher being kidnapped in Venezuela. You want to know more about this kind of great stuff? Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Wild Child, stories by T.C. Boyle. That's what we're talking about today on Conversations on the Coast. It is a book published by our friends at Viking Press, and some bracingly and impressively new works from the prolific author. With each book, Boyle becomes a more adventurous and interesting writer. That's what our friends at the Kirkus Review Service said. And I was glad to learn the other day that apparently is going to continue.
I hadn't heard that. I was disappointed when I'd heard that they were going to be given the hook, and I'm really happy. Yeah. I'm also happy that you mentioned, Jim, that our friends at Viking are providing this book and this book tour. I am one of the few authors who has all his books in print, and they've always continuously been in print, because that is because I have been with Viking Penguin throughout my career. And it gets even better. I introduced my editor to his wife in my living room.
Oh, my gosh. So he owes you forever.
He sure does.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories with a somewhat strange title and plot line, if you will, is something called 1,300 Rats, where in a nice neighborhood, a fellow by the name of Gerard Loomis loses his wife, becomes a bit of a recluse, takes on a large snake, and
isn't that what everybody does?
I think, yeah, sure, yeah, it's pretty much the second most popular thing. Yeah.
Well, in any case, this story is inspired by something I'd read in the newspaper, and the narrator of the story, one of his neighbors, Gerard's neighbors, suggests that he should get a pet. Everyone thinks, he'll get a pet it'll cheer him up.
That's right. Fill in the empty spaces.
That's right. And in fact, he, instead of getting a dog or a cat or anything like that, he claims he's allergic, he goes to the pet shop and gets a Burmese python. By the way, did you read that about half of the Burmese pythons, which are invading the Everglades, froze to death in the recent cold snap down there? Yeah.
No, well, that'll make them happy, I think, because they were getting really concerned.
They are an invasive species. At any rate, he gets one, and what does it eat? Well, it eats the white rat. He buys the white rat, he puts it in, and he feels pity for the rat. And he puts his hand in, and the rat, seeking an opportunity, climbs up his sleeve and sits on his shoulder. And he becomes kind of entranced with this warm-blooded creature who, has animation as opposed to the snake. And before long, the power is out, by the way, and it's snowing. The snake is frozen to death. And Gerard finds himself with a whole family of rats. And he loves them so much that he doesn't do much about their breeding propensity. And, of course, soon we have the legendary and titular 1,300 rats.
Oh, my gosh. And this is really a story which shows that when left on its own, nature will take over. And because this guy is left totally isolated, the man who comes to his house at the end has not been seeing him because he's been out of the country on a trip with his wife, and left behind this man. And in a sense, didn't know that he left the guy behind. But I guess he was his only connection.
Yeah, of course. And as you say, this fits in nicely with this thematic through line of most of these stories. They do have to do with our part in nature and how we are small compared to all the other forces of the world, and how you live with that and how you deal with it.
Well, this book even has a baseball story. The unlucky mother of Aquiles Maldonado. Wow.
Yes.
Poor unlucky mother.
I am a lover of baseball, and I have only written one baseball story before in my life, and one football story, by the way, 56-0. And the baseball story was the Hector Quesadilla story about a legendary LA Dodger player. This one, in fact, though, has a baseball player in it, although it's not really about baseball. He's a Venezuelan. His mother has been kidnapped and held for ransom, and he flies back from an unfortunate and bad season in the U.S. to try to redeem his mother. Yeah,
and it doesn't work out too well.
Well, in fact, I think it did work out pretty well. I don't have a lot of happy endings, and I won't give this one away, but there is a measure of redemption. But, of course, there's a lot of irony and joy. I mean, she's taken deep into the remote back country where the rebels are basically just a bunch of kids, unwashed and dirty kids, and she winds up being a mother to them out of boredom and out of frustration, washing their clothes, cooking for them, and so on.
Well, the pitcher is a kind of nice hero-type guy. He tells the police chief that, I give you my solemn pledge that I will sign 1 truckload of baseballs for the sons and daughters of every man in the Federal Police District of Caracas, and I will give to your son Aldo my complete 2003, 2004, 2005 sets of Topps baseball cards direct from the USA. Yeah, there was a pause. Then the chief's voice comes back at him. We leave in 1 hour. Bring a pair of boots.
Well, I love your quoting that. I'd forgotten entirely about it. But yeah, the timing is everything in such a joke,
Yeah.
And the police chief doesn't want him to come along. This would be a major incident if he's hurt in any way. But, Aquiles Maldonado is very convincing in the way that you've just quoted.
Well, we've got one more segment to go, and I think we're going to spend most of it on the title story called Wild Child. Don't miss it.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Wild Child, stories by T.C. Boyle. That's the subject of today's Conversations on the Coast, published, as always, is Mr. Boyle, by Viking. Now, there's a moment in this title story called Wildlife. It's Wild Child, in which the enfant sauvage is thusly described. It had no language, no ideas, no way of knowing he was alive or in what place he was alive or why. He was a feral, a living, breathing atavism, and his life was no different from the life of any other creation in the forest. Now, I got to tell you, that's the most downer opening, to build a character on, and yet you create from that, if you will, premise, an absolutely mesmerizing story.
Well, thanks, Jim, and I love the way you read that. In fact, I don't know why we're limited to only 3 6-minute segments. Let's go on and do 10 6-hour segments. I want to hear you read more.
We'll just keep reading and reading. We'll just keep
for those
reading.
who don't know, is a retelling of the story of Victor of Évreux, the wild child found in Napoleonic France and brought to Paris, captured and brought to Paris. He was perhaps 11 or 12 when he was captured. There was a slash mark, a scar of a slash mark across his throat, so we presume when he was very young, a child of 3, 4, who knows, he was taken out into the woods and left for dead, perhaps by one of the wicked stepmothers we read about in the Grimm's fairy tales when we were kids, and which puzzled us so much because our mothers loved us. He grew in the woods without any civilization, or more importantly, without any language or attachment to human beings until he was captured.
And that's why we call him feral, because exactly. he has no attachment, no sense of community, no, if you will, friend, no parent.
More than anything, what interests me is that he had no language. So you wonder, if you have no language, can you have ideas? I think my favorite times in life are when I am deep in the forest by myself, and I'm not really naming things, and I'm not really talking to myself or singing or with chattering, which I usually do all day long, but just sort of in awe of what I see around me, and I don't name it exactly, I just exist within it. And I think this is what happened with Victor throughout his life. So, he became celebrated in Paris because he was the illustration of the noble savage of Rousseau. Is it best to live a primitive life without cultivation, or is it a disaster? And are we meant to have society around us?
As you tell of his life in French society, I started to get angry about those people because I think at base they were all trying to find ways to exploit him, and to keep the show on the road.
I think to a degree, but the story has been told before in Truffaut's movie L'Enfant Sauvage of the early 70s, which I saw when it came out, by the way, but have not seen since because I didn't want it to interfere with my own telling. But at any rate, Victor was celebrated in Paris in his time. But again, he always seemed to me to remain a captive. And yes, Itard, his teacher, worked patiently with him for years to try to get him to understand and appreciate language, which he was never able to do, quite sadly.
No, and he wanted him to say some phrase, some word, and he only got him to say one thing, didn't he? Well,
his name, Victor, in French is Victor, with an open vowel at the end. And apparently they called him Victor because this was the only sound he could make. And Itard at first thought that he was naming himself. But in fact, in my telling anyway, he calls everything Victor. Then he learns that the word for milk is lait. So he calls everything lait. It's a question of cognition and a question of knowing what a word signifies, and he was unable to grasp that concept because, sadly, he had grown up wild during the period in his development in which he would normally have acquired language.
It seems to me like you're saying that his inability to get into language is the thing that kept him savage.
I don't know.
I mean, there are times
really.
in the story where it seems like he's right on the verge of relating positively to other people.
I wouldn't want to speculate, Jim, because it would ruin the story for all the other readers. I wouldn't want to give anything interpretive. And I'm not really saying, I don't have a program. I'm just exploring what it means. That said, yes, I think our ability to communicate and our ability to live in a society is very important to us. On the other hand, look what we've done to the other creatures of the earth with the 7 billion of us now and the environment. I've written about this theme many, many times. For instance, in Drop City, my book about set in 1970 about hippies going back to the earth, beginning, by the way, in Sonoma County, and then going up to Alaska. I've often wondered about this. Is it possible to live more simply? I don't think so. I think we're caught in a web of capitalism, which insists that we create more product and buy more product and create more consumers on infinitum. But of course, we live on a finite planet.
Yes, we do have to buy more product. Let's start out by buying at least 2 copies each of Wild Child, stories by T.C. Boyle. You won't be disappointed. And those of you who've been waiting for a price break on his last novel called Women, which is really terrific, this is your chance now, out there in paperbacks as we speak. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.